Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session in our security track. And I am happy to present Ying Li, who will be talking to us about multi-factor authentication and possession factors. Big hand for Ying, please.
Hi. Hi, my name is Ying. I work at Rackspace, not on authentication, but thank you all for coming despite that. I know this talk is supposed to be about multi-factor authentication. I'm actually going to go slightly off script. And instead, I'm just going to tell you a story about two people named Alice and Bob. Bob is a gamer. He really likes playing games, so he built his own, an MMO called World of Bobcraft. It became incredibly popular, so much so that in-game items and gold became worth real money on the open market, so stealing accounts became a very profitable business. One day, Alice, a longtime elite player with lots of high-level items and gold, reports that all her gear and items have been liquidated, her gold stolen by someone who hijacked her account. Bob has to spend all day verifying her story and restoring her accounts and possessions. Every day, more and more players start reporting their accounts stolen. Bob spends all of his time restoring accounts rather than making new content, which makes Bob sad. He reads about how companies like GitHub, Google, Facebook, and Blizzard added two-factor authentication to their services to increase account security. This seems to involve asking for two things on login instead of one, so Bob adds a second password requirement to the World of Bobcraft login, and account thefts continue, and Bob continues being sad. Why? What did Bob do wrong? Well, multi-factor authentication doesn't mean just asking for any two things on login. It requires at least two different factors, which are something you know, such as a password or a PIN, something you have, such as an ATM card, phone, or RSA token, and something you are, meaning something inherent to you, such as your fingerprints or your retinal pattern. Two of the same factors, like Bob's two required passwords, don't count. The reason they don't count is that using multiple passwords is like putting a secret, let's say the account data you want to protect, inside of a box, which represents a password, and
then I'll put that box inside of another box, and then I'll mail that box to myself. And when it arrives, I'll smash it with a hammer!
So the point of this completely legitimate and legal fair use of copyrighted material is that layers of boxes do not protect against an attacker who can open even a single box, because they can do the same to all the boxes. For instance, a keylogger will steal any number of passwords as easily as it will steal one, without any further cost to the attacker. Multi-factor auth is like placing a security guard in front of your box. An attacker has to be able to both get around the security guard and open the box. Even if they've stolen the key to the box from you, your password in this analogy, they don't automatically get past the security guard without having to do more work. Each type of factor has a different set of vulnerabilities or weaknesses that an attacker like this can use to break in. It's important to consider what this attacker is going to do and how your defenses will prevent against that, rather than just throwing up defenses willy-nilly without them actually doing anything. For instance, some attacks against password authentication include man-in-the-middle attacks, where an attacker sits between Alice and Bob and pretends he's Bob to Alice and pretends he's Alice to Bob and reads and perhaps modifies traffic that Alice was sending to Bob or vice versa. Password authentication is also vulnerable to phishing attacks, where an attacker tries to trick Alice into giving her password, keylogging attacks, where an attacker logs all the keystrokes on Alice's machine, and replay, where an attacker may not be able to read traffic, but he can copy traffic from Alice to Bob without being able to understand or modify it, and replays the traffic back to Bob at a later point while pretending to be Alice. Possession factors are also vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks, and they can be physically stolen, and then the attacker would be in possession of Alice's possession factor. Various types of possession factors also have their own weaknesses, but these are the general attacks against all possession factors without going into specifics. Biometric factors like fingerprints can also be stolen. People leave them everywhere, so an attacker can easily obtain them. Since fingerprints don't change, the credentials can never be revoked, and they're vulnerable to replay attacks. But this talk is just going to discuss two-factor authentication, 2FA if you ever see this acronym, using knowledge and possession factors because this is currently the most common combination. When two factors are combined, the attacks against two-factor auth is the intersection against one factor and the attacks against the other. So an attack that works only against one factor is insufficient to compromise login. If an attacker keylogs Alice's password, login is still protected by the token factor. And the way most possession factors work is that they produce a one-time password, which can only be used once. So even if an attacker gets Alice's complete login, by which I mean password and OTP, they can't use the token. Likewise, if the possession factor is stolen, the login is still protected by the password. The goal is to minimize this intersection of attacks. That's why Bob has to include at least two factors. If the same factor, say two passwords, is used twice, the intersection of attacks is the same as that for single-factor password authentication. But just because two factors are used doesn't mean that the intersection is as small as it could be. Apps that provide soft tokens, like Google Authenticator, Authy, and Dual Security, can run on phones and make it really easy for Alice to use multi-factor authentication without having to buy a hard token. But phones are general-purpose computing devices, meaning they can be exploited, meaning the token and password can be compromised at the same time. So this intersection becomes this. When using a soft token on a phone, the intersection contains another attack, which is exploit the phone. As you can see, there's still fewer attacks than in single-factor password authentication. So it's not that Alice should not use soft tokens on her phone. It's that she should be aware of the other attack and take extra care with the security on her phone. So now knowing what multi-factor authentication is, Bob surveys other sites that provide it and find the most commonly supported possession factors. These possession factors all produce tokens that are one-time passwords, meaning they expire after a brief time, they expire after a single use, or both. The most common tokens on smartphones, which are supported by the previously mentioned apps, are open authentication time-based one-time passwords, TOTPs, which usually expire after about 30 seconds. This is OATH, not OAuth. This is authentication. OAuth is for authorization, which I know is super clear. TOTP, again, time-based one-time passwords, require a shared secret between the client and server, and are generated using the secret and the current time. The TOTP generated by Alice's app is valid if it matches the TOTP generated by World of Bobcraft. The algorithm is pretty short and simple, specified in those RFCs, and there are many Python libraries that support it. For instance, cryptography not only supports it, but many other cryptographic capabilities. OTP auth just supports OATH, but also includes a nice example of how to generate a QR code from the shared secret so that you can communicate the shared secret to your user. Many sites also support SMS-based one-time passwords. Bob would text Alice a random OTP, and she must provide it back. This works even if Alice doesn't have a smartphone. Twilio provides a REST API that can let Bob send any SMS to Alice, allowing him to support SMS-based authentication. Any HTTP client can be used, but Twilio also provides a nice Python Twilio client. A commonly supported consumer hard token is the Yubikey, which acts as a USB keyboard. Alice just has to plug it in, press the button, and it generates an OTP based on a counter. Yubikey provides a validation service as well as an open source validation server so that Bob can run one on his own rather than depend on Yubikey. There are quite a few Python client libraries that support access to the validation API. The first one is the official one. The second one is the one that we'll be using in examples because typing is shorter. Okay, so what does Bob need to do to support possession factors? He has to let Alice add factors to her account. He has to validate the factor when Alice logs in. And he has to let Alice remove factors from her account. Bob figures out the general pattern to add two-factor auth from scratch to a general Python application, which also applies to apps using frameworks such as Flask and Twisted. The next few slides are going to assume a user model that looks something like this. It has a collection of possession factors in order of preference of Alice because Bob would like to support backup devices in case Alice loses her preferred device, which would be the first factor in the collection. All of Bob's factors will have this interface, has a function to check whether an OTP is valid, a start, because some factors require setup before every OTP, a start function that does the setup, and the prompt is for later when Bob has to ask Alice for her OTP. So first we're going to cover TOTPs. The flow is that Bob generates a shared secret, communicates the shared secret to Alice via a QR code, and then when Alice wants to authenticate using this factor, she generates a TOTP from the shared secret, which she gives back to Bob, and Bob has to match it against the TOTP that he produces from the shared secret. For the factor code, Bob generates a random shared secret, and he uses the OTP auth library to check the validity of the OTP given this secret. There's no setup except when first configuring the factor, so the start function does nothing. To configure the factor, Bob sends a QR code, like the diagram says, waits for a response, and if the token checks out, Bob can add the factor to her account. The get user input function here is synchronous and is also not implemented in the slides, hence it's imported from the made-up module. For web apps, the QR code and a form would have to be rendered on a page, so in reality, asking the user for their OTP is probably asynchronous, stateful, and much more complex. Speaking of QR codes, this is the general form of the URI to be encoded in the QR code. It specifies the algorithm used, the issuer, and the username, because Alice's app may be generating OTPs from multiple services. This helps the app label which token belongs to World of Bobcraft and which token belongs to World of Carolcraft. OTP auth generates this URI when given the relevant information, so this is what the generate QR code function looks like. For the SMS factor, Bob uses Twilio to send SMSs. And the way SMS tokens work is that Alice gives Bob her phone number, Bob generates some random token, texts it to Alice at that number, and the token that Alice gives back to Bob has to match what Bob texted her. Bob first needs an account with Twilio so that he can provide his account ID and auth token to the REST client. He also needs a Twilio number he can send SMSs from, because this start function stores the generated OTP, texts it to Alice at the number she gave him from Bob's number registered with Twilio. Validating the OTP is just checking that it matches the stored one. This is a naive implementation that doesn't take into account sending Alice multiple tokens, token expiry, or API failures, but this is the general idea. There's one extra check in this add factor function. The configuration only continues if the phone number has not already been configured for Alice. If it's already on Alice's account, it bails. But if it is, then it proceeds like the diagram. Bob texts Alice, Alice gives back a valid OTP, then the phone number is added to Alice's account as a possession factor. So now for the Yubikey factor. And before we begin, it's good to know that every time the Yubikey button is pressed, an OTP is produced that has the ID of the Yubikey, which never changes, concatenated to the actual OTP part, which changes every time and is exactly 32 characters. So to get the ID, you just chomp off the last 32 characters of the Yubikey OTP. So whenever Alice provides an OTP, Bob checks it with Yubico servers and also extracts the ID of the Yubikey, which is that cookie-looking thing. If the ID matches the one that Alice previously registered, then Alice is using the same Yubikey as she'd registered. And if Yubico also says that it's a valid OTP, then yay, Alice is authenticated. To validate it against Yubico, Bob has to generate a client ID and a secret symmetric key for World of Bobcraft. The key is used by Yubico to sign their responses so that Bob knows a response is from Yubico and not spoofed by an attacker. Like the TOTP, the start function does nothing because there's no setup. The check OTP code then just does what the diagram described. It validates the OTP, and the client validates the signature. It extracts the Yubikey ID, checks it against the stored ID. Again, this is a simplified implementation, does not take into account API failures and what happens if there are signature failures. When adding a Yubikey, Alice needs to provide the OTP, and if the factor that with that particular Yubikey ID hasn't been configured already, and the OTP validates, then Bob can add that Yubikey ID as a factor for her account. So now for validating a token on login. This part is simpler because most of the work was already done in the factor abstractions, which is what made the previous part somewhat more complex and lengthy. The logic is that Alice gives Bob her username and password. Bob checks that the user exists, that the password checks out, sees if Alice has a second factor configured, and if so, he asks Alice for the second factor credentials. Then Alice gives those credentials back to Bob, and Bob validates those credentials. Here, Bob starts off with a login function, which checks the user, the password, and the possession factor. Bob also made it take a post-login argument, which is a callable that executes post-login logic. We'll see why in a sec. Checking the possession factor just means that Bob sees whether Alice has at least one configured possession factor. If so, he asks for the OTP, validates it using the preferred factor, which is the first factor in the collection. If everything's good, post-login logic executes. And remember how each factor has a start function for setup and a prompt to ask for the user's token? It's so that this function could be factor independent rather than a giant nested if-else tree. To support backup devices, Bob asks for both the type of factor and the token. The default factor would, of course, be the preferred factor, but Alice can pick a different factor, one of her backup factors. If the token is validated no matter what, but if the factor she picked is a backup factor, then an email is sent to her warning her that a backup factor and not her preferred factor was used, because this should be an unusual occurrence and might be an attacker. So now with both factor abstractions and login implementation established, revocation is even simpler. There's not even a diagram. Removing a factor is just deleting it from the collection. But since this could be an attacker trying to decrease account security, a warning email should be sent to Alice anytime a factor is removed. Even better would be if high privilege functionality like this would require Alice to log in again. Remember how the login function took a post-login callable? So for a more secure remove factor function, that callable can be the non-sudoed remove factor function. So that was adding two-factor auth from scratch to a toy application. The full code is up on my GitHub repo to run as a little command line demo. The made-up module is actually implemented. For something more Flask specific, the Twilio blog has a very nice example of how to add TOTPs and SMS factors to a Flask app. But certain parts of World of Bobcraft use Django, and there's Django middleware that handles two-factor auth for you. One of the most complete plugins is Django OTP. It's a framework that provides support for all the previously mentioned authentication methods, although Twilio and Yubikey support are separate plugins. It has models for the devices, and it updates the user model to include whether two-factor authentication is enabled. All you need to do is install them and add the middleware classes and installed apps to django.appsettings.py. There's another project, Django TwoFactor Auth, which integrates Django OTP into Django's built-in authentication framework and makes it really easy to patch the login view to be a multi-factor login view. There's no UI support for Yubikey devices yet, but there's a there's an issue out for that. Bob just adds some more installed apps and a login URL to settings.py, along with his credentials for his Twilio account. And he adds a two-factor URL route as the login route. And Alice, when logged in, can now enable two-factor authentication and configure her preferred factor. If the configuration slides went by really quickly, don't worry. The docs for Django OTP describe the installation and configuration in detail more than these slides do. And Django two-factor auth has just as extensive docs and also comes with a nice example Django app that demonstrates its use, which is where the previous screenshots came from. The example app is available to try online. Of course, Bob wrote all his own views and themed everything for World of Bobcraft, but it gave him a good idea of what to do. Bob could also have used a device like Duo Security or Authy, which would handle Alice's second factor completely. Bob just has to register with the device, let them know about Alice, and the service does all of these things that Bob had to do before by himself. Alice has to register her devices with the service instead of World of Bobcraft, but then when she logs in, Bob validates her password, the service handles her second factor. So now, authentication is secure, and Bob lives happily ever after creating content. Alice never loses control of her dungeon loot again, right? Well, there are several ways of authenticating a player to World of Bobcraft, not just login. And login has been protected by Bob using multi-factor authentication. But not every request made to World of Bobcraft requires a password and token. An attacker can use some other form of authentication. For instance, after logging in, World of Bobcraft saves a session key for Alice to authenticate her on subsequent requests until she logs out. An attacker who eavesdrops this key then has full access to Alice's account. Eavesdropping can be mitigated using TLS, also known as SSL, to encrypt all traffic. However, encrypted traffic won't help if Alice is man-in-the-middled with an attacker who pretends to be World of Bobcraft. So Bob has to provide a valid TLS certificate, and Alice's client must verify it, very important, in order to mitigate the threat of a man-in-the-middle attack. But as we've seen from this year alone and from Hinnick's talk earlier on TLS, libraries that provide TLS support can have vulnerabilities, some of which negate the point of using it in the first place. So both Alice and Bob have to respond immediately to any required patching of TLS libraries and keep everything up to date. Oh hey, something else is vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks, and is not anymore. Another type of authentication is API keys or access tokens, such as OAuth, not OATH this time, for applications that need to authenticate in the background without any interaction with the user. For instance, the World of Bobcraft mobile app, which allows Alice to check her auctions and in-game mail. Bob makes sure that every app has to request a different API key so that they're all revocable and auditable independently of each other. And he also limits how much access each API key has, giving it only as much privilege as it needs, so that an attacker who's stolen Alice's mobile API key doesn't have full access to her account. Bob makes use of Django OTP's OTP required decorator, which behaves like Django's login required decorator, but requires that the user have to be logged in using multifactor auth. Potentially dangerous changes, like changing passwords, token factors, or emails, can compromise the security of an account. So changes like these would be good candidates for requiring that the user be logged in with multifactor auth. Even better would be to require Alice to provide credentials again, as she would if she were executing sudo commands. And all such dangerous actions should result in a warning email being sent to Alice in case they're taken by an attacker and not her. And Alice, much more careful now because her account had been stolen, pays careful attention to these emails even though they might seem annoying or kind of spammy. By doing all these things, Bob protects access to Alice's account as much as possible while keeping usability and ease of access high. As mentioned before, World of Bobcraft provides a recovery mechanism in case Alice has to change her credentials. Account recovery is just login again. Anyone who recovers an account is just resetting the account credentials. Recovery should be auditable and rare. All such changes should be logged so that malicious attempts to reset credentials can be identified. And reset should be difficult at least as much as regular login, or all attackers will just go after the lowest hanging fruit, which is account reset, which is why Bob keeps obsessing over this. So Bob has provided backup devices so that Alice can use the backup token to log in and disable the primary token, which is supported by Django TwoFactor Auth. But Bob could have also emailed Alice with a reset link, forcing Alice to prove that she's in possession of the email account associated with her account. This is a standard mechanism that services with only single-factor auth provide to reset passwords. But even services with multi-factor auth fall back on this if the user doesn't have backup devices configured. Unfortunately, email is not gated by multi-factor auth, so it turns into something you know that Bob started with. So, what has Alice done? Alice has set up two-factor auth for World of Bobcraft. She set up backup factors so that she doesn't have to resort to email reset. She has chosen different strong passwords for both World of Bobcraft and her email account. And she set up two-factor auth with her email too because she really wants to receive those warning emails and account reset emails. She's careful about what she does to her phone. She sets up a lock screen and remote wipes so that she keeps her soft tokens safe. And she keeps her systems up to date so that any vulnerabilities can be patched as soon as possible. She has not had any more incidents of account theft and is now the highest level wizard sniper in World of Bobcraft. Bob has implemented and started promoting multi-factor auth to all his players. He provides secure and auditable recovery options, encrypts all traffic, and limits privileges of less secure forms of authentication. He keeps all the crypto libraries needed to provide said security up to date. And now account theft is down in World of Bobcraft, not gone because not all players are careful like Alice is. But he spends a much higher percentage of his time designing content. Sorry, it's not moving. Okay, whatever. So, and they both lived happily and if vigilantly ever after. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ying. We don't have time for questions right now, but there is space out for a hallway BOF if you would like to ask Ying any questions about her presentation. We are now taking a break for a few minutes. Please feel free to go down. There is still some swag left in the exposition hall with all of the sponsors. Please check them out and give them a moment of your time. Thank you.
Sorry, I ran really